Alright, so now let's talk about connecting geometry to help and assist you with your workflow when working with subdivision modeling. So you're probably thinking, wait a minute, what are you talking about connecting geometry? Well, let's say that your client contacts you and says, hey, you've done a great job with this stuff in the past, and we want you to model this. But here's the thing, we want you to model this as one solid object, and we want all of the edges to be rounded, and we want you to use subdivision surface modeling to do it. So what that means is, in order to get the hole here in the side, and in order to extrude the hole for this handle, because these are 90-degree rounded extrusions here, we can't use any bools. Now I know a lot of people like to use a bool in order to connect something like this handle. You would just model that with a spline and a SweepNURB, and then you could just use that with a bool in order to connect it and maybe create some holes and whatnot. But of course, like I've said before, bools are nasty. I don't like using them. So we're not going to do that. I'm going to show you how to properly model this, and I'm going to show you how to create the handle with a SweepNURB object, and then how to connect that down to the main cylinder, and then create one object out of that. Okay, so let's start out with a cylinder. And I'm going to change the radius here to 100. I'm going to change its orientation. And we need to make it a little longer. So maybe we'll go with a height of about 500. And we want to split it once right down the middle, because we're going to use symmetry later on in order to mirror the other side over. So we'll just take and split this to 2 segments here for the height segment. And there we go. Now we also want to go to the caps and turn that off, because we do not need any caps right now. We'll add those later. And again, because we're using a HyperNURB object, in order to provide the subdivision, we don't need 36 segments for the rotational segments. In this case, we want to use a value of 8. So we'll take this number down to 8. And there we go. Now that looks a lot better. When we turn the HyperNURB on, you can see that we are getting really nice smoothing. So we know a value of 8 will give us enough subdivision. Okay, so let's make this editable. And I'm just going to go into point mode, grab the rectangle selection. Be sure that only select visible elements is turned off. Go to a top view, and I want to select these points over here on this side. That's going to be these points over on that end there. And we'll just delete them. Okay, so now we only have half of our cylinder, which is what we want because we only want to model one half of it. Then we'll use symmetry in order to mirror over the other half. So we know that we need to extrude some type of circular round handle that's going to come up out of the top of this cylinder. And when we do that, we know that we want to maintain the perfect cylindrical roundness of this cylinder. We don't want to disturb that in order to warp it or make it look odd in some way. So I'm going to create a circle spline. I'm going to change the orientation to where it lays flat. I'm going to quickly just change the color. I'll just use bright red again, and I need to pull it up above the object, and I want to position it to where it sits over here to the side, and we want to shrink it down. And I think our handle, I think maybe a value of maybe 30, well, maybe 35 is too much. Maybe we'll go with a value of 30. Okay, yeah, I think 30 will work okay for us. And of course we need to change the intermediate points here from adaptive to uniform, and we want to take this value down to 1. Okay, so now we have our reference spline in place. You can click on the cylinder, go get the knife tool, and we'll take this over to loop mode. And I want to make a cut right down at the center to where the highlight line from this knife tool will line up with that edge there. So about right there, so we'll make the cut there. And that looks pretty good to me. Now I also want to make a cut somewhere in this area here. And the reason for that is because you'll notice that between this point here on our reference spline, there's a little bit of distance between this point and the point over here on the edge of the cylinder. So between here and here, there's a little bit of space going on right in there. And I also want the same amount of distance over here on this side. Now this doesn't have to be 100% accurate for this, but if you are looking for accuracy, what you can do is use the Measure and Construction tool. So we'll go up here to Tools, and we'll go to Measure and Construction. Now by default, when you pull up this tool, it's going to give you a red arrow over here. So in order to see that better, we need to go to a perspective view. Okay, so there is the arrow there, and you can see that it's telling you from the world origin point up to the top point here in the cylinder, it is exactly 100 centimeters. Now we know we don't want to measure that. We actually want to measure the distance between the points over here. So I'm going to go back to a top view. I'm going to grab this red arrow and I'm going to drag, and you can see what's happening here. It's actually snapping to certain points. So we want to snap it over to this point here, and then we want to grab the tip of that arrow and we want to snap it to this point here. So it's now telling us that there is a distance value between these 2 points of 53.189 centimeters. Now I want to make a cut over here that's going to have the same distance between this center cut and this new cut of 53.189. So I'm going to grab the knife tool. I'm just going to make a cut over here out of the way. I'm going to now select all of those points that were just created with that loop cut. And I'm going to go back to the Measure Construction tool. I'm going to grab this point here for this tip of the arrow. And I'm going to pull it over here to this point. And then I'm going to grab this point here and pull it over here. Now you can see that the value here is less than what it should be. So what we can do is come over here to the distance value for the Measure and Construction tool, and we want to type in a value of 53.189. I believe that's what the value was. Press enter, and now it has pushed those points over to where we now have equal distance between these 3 loop cuts here. So now we need to get this measure out of the way. We no longer need it. So I'll just come over here and click on Delete Measure. That'll get rid of it. Now we can get out of that tool. Okay, so now we want to go grab the knife tool. I want to go into line mode. Be sure that visible only is turned on because we only want to make cuts on the top of the cylinder. So we want to go from this point here down to this point. From here we'll make another cut there and over to here. Now there's different ways that you can go about creating the shape that we need here. I'm just showing you one way of doing it. And then we'll just connect that side there. So what we've done here is we've created somewhat of a diamond pattern. And now what we can do is connect from the center of this edge out to that point. We'll go from this edge to that adjacent point. We'll do the same for these 2 down here. Now, if we go back over here to a side view, you can see the cuts that we made marked by the point. See, there's a point there, there's some points there as well. But notice how they're all in line with this edge. None of these points are actually sitting up or down. Everything is nice and straight and in line with that edge. And that's the way we want to keep it. But notice that these points here need to be lined up with the outside point on the reference spline. So, like I showed you in an earlier lesson, if we were to take this point and move it over to where it lines up, notice now how this point has now become out of line with the cylinder. So that means we have to take this point and push it back down. And depending on how many points you have, that can be a little tedious. So in order to get around this, we'll just use the slide tool. So we need to push this point around until it lines up there with our reference spline. And we just want to do this on these 4 outside corners here. And if we go back to a side view, you can see that by using the slide tool, it has kept all of these new cuts and points in line with the cylinder edge. Okay, so now what we want to do is select those inside polygons, and we can actually turn off that circle spline. We no longer need it. And I'm just going to extrude that up to about there. Now we want to straighten these polygons out, because if we look at this from a side view, you can see that right now it's following the edge in which it was extruded off of. So what I'm going to do is go down here to the size for the Y value, and I'm just going to zero that out, and now it's nice and flat across the top. We also want to delete those 4 polygons at the top. So if we turn the HyperNURB on, it's starting to take shape. Needs a little work. So what we can do is take the knife tool, go into loop mode, and we'll just make a cut down around the bottom base of this extrusion. So something about right there should work. That will tighten that up for us. We'll turn the HyperNURB back on, and now we have a nice edge. Alright, so now we want to address the problem of the handle. The handle, if we go to a side view here, change the display, the handle needs to come up and then go over, and it needs to have a rounded beveled bend to it. Now we could go into edge mode, we could select those edges there, and we could extrude them up and then try to twist them over, and then make another extrusion over, and just make some adjustments to these points and these edges in order to line things up. And we could do that, but I'd rather do it a different way. So I'm going to undo that. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to select here at the top of this extrusion, and I'm going to use a command called edge to spline. And what it does is it takes a selection of edges and converts that to a spline. Now I have mine docked over here in my palette, but you can get to it by going to Mesh, Commands, Edge to Spline. It's going to create a spline that's going to be a child of your cylinder or your object. So we'll just drag that out, and you can see here what it's done is created the spline for us. So we'll take that spline and pull it up. You can see the axis handle is way over here on the world origin. So I'm just going to use the axis center here to just center that. That way it will center the axis handle here to the spline. Okay, so now what we want to do is go to a side view, and I want to draw out with a linear spline. I'm just going to draw something like this. I'm going to go maybe to about there, and then over here. Alright, now we know since we're working with symmetry, this point here needs to be centered out. So for the X value, we need to center that. Now we know we have a height value here of Y of 188.855. So I'm going to double click that and choose copy. I'm going to paste that value over to this point. That way these points are in line here. And now we need to line these points up to where they're going to be in the very center of this extrusion. So I'm going to select the cylinder. I'm going to select the center point here for that extrusion. And this point's X value is right here. So we'll just double click that to copy that value. Right click and choose copy. We'll go back to our spline. I'm going to select that bottom point. I'm going to paste in the value. I'm going to do the same for this top one. And there we go. Now we have our spline in place. So with this point here on this 90-degree corner selected, I'm going to use the chamfer command. So I have mine again over here in a palette. But you can get to that by going to, let's see, where is it at? Mesh, Splines, Chamfer. So it gives us a radius here that we can determine. Now a higher radius will give us more of a rounding, and a lower radius will give us a very small rounding. So a value of 5, we'll try that. So I'm going to hit apply. And you can see that if we zoom into it, it did round that out for us, but that's not enough. I'm going to go over here and adjust this value up, and you can see that it is adjusting live in the viewport. So we'll take this up to maybe a value of, I don't know, maybe let's go a little lower than 50, maybe a value of 45. Okay, so 45 looks good. Now since we have that, now we can add a SweepNURB, and we also need a circle spline. Now in this case, we already have a circle spline which is the spline that we created from the edges on the cylinder. So we're going to take the spline path, and we'll drop that in first, take the cylinder spline, drop that in next, and by doing that, we instantly run into a problem. You can see that now this is really paper thin and it doesn't look right. So more than likely we're probably going to need to adjust the axis handle position, or actually the rotation, for the cylinder spline. So we'll click on the cylinder spline, and we need to come over here and turn on the axis modification mode. So we'll click that to enable that. We'll grab the rotate tool. So we need to determine which way is going to fix the problem. So if we move this around, that's not going to work. Let's try this way here. That's not working either, so it's going to be that way there. Okay, so that's going to be the way to solve it. Okay, so I'm just going to undo that to go back to where it originally was, and I'm going to click on the rotation handle, then hold down Shift, and I'm going to rotate that over till it hits to 90 degrees. Now we can click on the SweepNURB, and we can see that we've got way too many subdivisions here for the corner. So what we want to do is click on the spline, which was the path, and in order to see this a little better, I'm going to change the display mode to ground shading lines so we can see those subdivision lines. So for the spline, for the intermediate points, I'm going to take this angle here and I'm going to start taking that value up till we get to about right there. So a value of about, let's try, a value of 45 degrees will work just fine. Alright, so there we go. Now what we want to do is take the SweepNURB and we want to turn off the caps. We don't need any caps, so we'll just set both of these to none. That way both ends are open. And then we'll make that editable. I'll just hide the cylinder for a moment. And be sure that you exit out of axis modification mode. Now we want to connect these two together. So what we can do is take the SweepNURB, and just to give us a little bit of room, what I'm going to do is select this bottom row of points on the handle. I'm going to pull them up a little bit just to put a little bit of a gap in there. I'm going to select the SweepNURB and the cylinder. I'm going to use the connect plus delete command. Now it is one single object, so now we need to go into edge mode. And we already have one edge loop selected there, which is good. Now we just need to select the edge of the opening here for the handle. So we'll hold down Shift to select that edge as well. We're going to right click, and now we're going to use the Stitch and Sew tool. So we'll click on that, and what we want to do is click from this point and go all the way down to here. You can see there's a white line that is now highlighted between the two. And we'll just click to there and release, and now it has welded those two loop selections together into one loop cut. So now if we drop that into the HyperNURB, turn that on, there we go. Now you can see that we're going to need to make some adjustments up here. You can see that this edge is not looking quite right. It looks a little deformed and a little bent. Now the reason for this is because this row of edges here and this row of edges here, you can see that they're not completely straight. They're kind of slanted slightly. This row here needs to be horizontal. This row here needs to be completely straight up and down vertical, but they're not. So it's causing a little bit of trouble when we turn the HyperNURB on, and it's actually bending that a little more than what we really want. So a really quick and easy way to fix this is to select that loop of edges. You can see that we do have them all selected. And for the X value in size here, we can just zero that out. And then we can do the same for this loop of edges there. But this time we want to do it in the Y value. So now when we turn the HyperNURB back on, it's still going to look a little strange because we need to add an additional cut to help control that edge. And then one down here. Now that looks a lot better. So the next thing to do really quick to finish this off is to take this end and fill it in. Alright, so with the loop selection tool, I want to select this outside boundary, but you can see it's not letting me do it. So we need to come over here and activate select boundary loop. So now it's going to let me select that. And what I want to do is I want to pull this edge out, but I don't want to pull this loop out like that. I actually want to make an extrusion. So while we're in edge mode, I'm going to hold down Control. It's going to drag out to make a little bit of an extrusion there. Now I'm going to go grab the extrude tool. I'm going to be sure to offset is set to 0. Hit apply. Grab the scale tool. Scale that in. Back to the move tool. Hold down Control and pull that edge back. But I want to zero that out. So with those edges selected there, we'll just zero out the X position. That will zero them out for us. Turn the HyperNURB on. Not going to look quite right. We need to add some control cuts. So I'll make one there, and then one on the inside. All right, there we go. All right, so to finish this off, we'll grab the symmetry object. We'll drop the symmetry into the HyperNURB, then the object here into the symmetry. All right, so I think that about wraps up this lesson on connecting multiple geometry together. We actually went over a few new tools this time. We used the measure and construction tool. We also used the stitch and sew tool. And we also used another very helpful tool, which was the edge to spline command. And that really helped us determine the shape for our handle. And then we just connected everything together. All right, so that wraps this up. And again, thanks for watching, guys.